On the build show today, we're gonna take a look at traditional brick versus thin brick. Now, when you look at these, you can tell the difference automatically, right? That traditional brick weighs 4 to 5 pounds. That thin brick, only about a pound per. And when it's all done, you have a hard time telling the difference between the two, because ultimately only the front face is gonna show, but they're very different products and they're also installed very, very differently. I'm gonna show you all the details and show you how to do it right. Today's video is sponsored by Dorkin. Let's get going. Now I'm actually at my house where we're doing a sample of some different bricks, and I thought this was a great place to show you what a traditional brick install looks like. As you know, it's stacked up on the foundation, so you have to have a brick lug or a brick ledge on your foundation to receive it, because you need to bear all that weight of this heavy brick onto the concrete. And then as you stack it up, you're gonna notice this happens right here. That's that air gap that's traditional behind brick. It means that any water that gets behind the brick in any way, shape, or form is gonna have this pressure equalized space that water is gonna fall down. Now, thin brick, on the other hand, is gonna basically adhere right to the building. You're gonna kind of stick it to the building. And then when you get to corners, they're gonna make corner pieces like this, so you can actually span the corners. And when it's all done, as I said, you can't tell the difference. But we don't have that traditional air gap on this thin brick like we do on traditional brick. Let's actually go to a job site where we've got thin brick going on. Okay, so we're on a job site now that has thin brick going on, and let's talk about those differences between thick and thin. Now, you'll notice on this house, we've got this thin brick and it's right up against the house. We don't have that traditional brick lug and it's getting started up there. You actually notice we've got a starter board right here that's screwed into the house, and then we're running the brick from that point forward. The reason why we're doing this is because the house is actually bearing the weight of this thin brick instead of the foundation bearing the weight. There's a great article by my friend Joe Stiebrick called The Stucco-Pocalypse, talking about how wood frame buildings that have been built with stucco have had serious problems over the last couple decades because the details have been done wrong. And stucco traditionally does not have that air gap behind it. So let's talk about how we can do thin brick but get the durability of the long-term brick. And actually it starts in a very similar process to stucco. Now here's how we're gonna get that air gap like we've got on brick. We're gonna use this right here. This is a Dimple mat material. This is made by Dorkin, and this is called Delta Dry and Lath. What it is a plastic, a polyethylene material with a dimple face on here. And these dimples are gonna go right up against the shear wall or the WRB. Now, whether you're using zip or Alumaflash like we have here, what it's gonna do is give you that air gap in front of your air and water barrier, and that's critical. Now, on the face of this, you're gonna see it comes pre-applied with a synthetic lath. This is basically a fiberglass lath. It is awesome because, number one, it's light. You can grab a whole roll of this stuff and throw it over your shoulder. Number two, we got no cut issues. And number three, the synthetic lath is great because we don't have any rust issues. It's not gonna rust out through the building. We're not gonna have any moisture issues with this. Now, this goes on pretty easily. In fact, my stucco guy is installing it for me before my thin brick. And all we're gonna do is, see these bands right here where this lath is real close together? We're gonna drop a screw in each one of these bands at every stud location. So this then is what's gonna hang on the building and hold eventually our stucco coat, or in this case, our thin brick coat. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this thin brick starts just like a stucco job. And in fact, this house that we're on here has a mixture of what it looks like stucco, it's actually exterior plaster, and thin brick. So we're varying it on the facade. And the beauty of this thin brick, as I mentioned earlier, is we don't have to go down to the foundation. The wood framing can hold the load of this because it's not nearly as heavy as traditional brick. So for instance, I've got a great pop out on the side of this house that the architect and City Home Collective, our designer, wanted to go ahead and thin brick, no problem. Okay, so once we've got this installed, this dimple mat, which is gonna give us that air gap, the next step is to come in with the stucco guys and they're gonna do what's called a scratch coat. That's where they're gonna take the first coat, the base coat, they're gonna scratch it on. And when they scratch it on, it's actually gonna tooth in to this just like it would if it was traditional lath or steel lath. And that's what's actually holding that onto the building. The next coat is the brown coat, and that's what's still exposed right here. Now, if we were gonna move on to a more traditional stucco, we'd put a final coat of stucco, but in this case, we go with the brown coat, and then we're ready for thin brick. Now, thin brick is in effect a tile on the outside of the building. You can see it's just a little thicker than a traditional tile you might use for an interior shower, but it's basically the same process. And in fact, the guys doing this job for me do a lot of my interior tile work as well. We're gonna use a MyPay thin set. This is one that's rated for exterior use. We wanna make sure we're doing that. And the guys are putting it on just like we were tiling a shower. They're gonna use a notch trowel. They're gonna create that thin set bond between this brown coat and our thin set, and they're going to install it with spacers so that we can get that gap nice and even and consistent, because later we're going to come back with a mortar and mortar this in. Now, when you're all done, you'll see on the back of this house, you really can't tell whether this is thin brick or regular brick, especially when you've got a really good tile setter like Luis and his crew on this job. They've just done a bang up job. And I really like on this house how they've varied the brick pattern, the exterior plaster look. The exterior plaster has a mottled finish. It's beautiful. But behind all of that, as I said earlier, you gotta have this dimple mat. You really need that air gap. Now, a couple details on the air gap. To make an air gap effective, you need an inlet and an outlet. It's gonna be a little hard to see that outlet on this building, but we basically have an air gap at the top with this right here. This is also made by Dorkin. It looks like kind of like a Brillo pad material, kind of a 3D mesh. And if you look closely at it, you can see through it, light will get through. The idea is that when this is at the bottom or the top of the wall, we can get airflow through there, but the bugs are gonna get trapped and they're not gonna be able to get through there. It's gonna give a bit of a barrier. Now at the base of this house, we've got a stone detail. So we're gonna be stoning up to the bottom. And then as we come up to this little chalk line right here, we're gonna transition to a cut stone piece that will be kind of like a water table at the edge with the pitch. And then from the cut stone, that's where we'll actually install this bug screen right on top of that. And then there's gonna be a flashing detail that will come out and kick any water back out there. But the idea is we wanna make sure there's airflow at the bottom and the top of the wall. Another place you can see that really well is on our overhang over here. Amy, my project manager on this job, did a great job working out those details with my stucco guy who got it started. And you're gonna see we've got a pretty traditional looking stucco J bead at the bottom, which has a perforation, which has holes in it. And then we've got our hardy soffit over there. So when that all gets painted up, it's gonna kind of go away. But again, we don't have to worry about steel or other issues with carrying the load of that if that was traditional brick on that pop out. In fact, you just wouldn't ever use traditional brick on a pop out, but you can when it's this thin brick. Hey guys, thanks for joining me for this deep dive in brick, thin versus thick. I do want to say a big thanks to these guys. Dorkin, who makes this dimple mat, has been a long-time supporter of the Build Show. Fantastic products. These guys really have durability in mind. And if you follow this assembly, I mean, we're talking about thin brick that's gonna last as long as a regular brick job. Decades and decades, if not hundreds of years. Hey guys, one quick afterthought. I was just finishing this video and realized this wall behind me is the perfect example of why we want that dimple mat, that air gap behind no matter what our exterior cladding is. Now remember I mentioned on this house, we've got a mixture of both exterior plaster, basically stucco, and that thin brick. Look at this facade. It rained really hard in Austin yesterday. And if you look at this face here, at the top, you see how the plaster, well, it's actually not finished yet. We still have one more coat to go. This is kind of the primer coat before the final plaster goes on. Look how white it is underneath the overhang there. This house has about a, I don't know, 12 or 18 inch overhang. It's nice and white at the top. And as you move down the wall, see how dark it gets? What you're seeing there is the wall has gotten soaked from water. And that's happening all over the US when it rains. Right up against the eave, you know, the first couple feet, the facade stays real dry, but if you have any amount of wind, if you have any amount of large rain, the rest of the house gets wet. Now when you've got a cladding like stucco or like thin brick, those are called reservoir claddings. We're getting a little nerdy here. Those are claddings that absorb water. You know, your traditional, let's say hardy plank siding that's painted, it doesn't absorb a lot of water. This does. This is basically a vertical sidewalk on the outside of your house. Very absorptive. So you've got this sponge on the outside, and when that sponge, that wet sponge, is sitting against your wood framed house, the sun is going to come out today. And in fact, the sun's going to come around here in the corner in another hour or so and hit this facade. When the sun hits that facade, it's going to want to dry that water out. And where's that water going to go? Some of it's going to come out the face, some of it's going to be driven towards the building. And that's why we like this Dimple mat material. Let me grab a piece of this here real quick. This Dimple mat material, as I mentioned in the video, this is polyethylene. And when we put that stucco or thin brick on the front and it gets wet and wants to drive that moisture towards the house, it's going to hit that polyethylene, which is a vapor barrier, and it's not going to be able to dry through this. It's going to dry towards the face. It also is ensuring that this channel right here, which is our drainage channel, if there is some water in there, is going to be able to drain and dry out. We want that airflow in there to dry it out. Just thought I'd show you this quick afterthought, especially because that rain gave us the perfect example to get nerdy for a minute. All right, guys, thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.